much for joining us today. I'm Joyce Kennedy with People and Pollinators Action Network, and we're excited to have such a distinguished panel of experts to lead us through the health issue around children's exposure to pesticides and important ways to reduce the risks that can begin at home and carry over into spaces where children like to play, like school grounds and playing fields. If you've been attending our webinars, you know that PPAN's work stretches from the protection of the pollinator species, our keystone species, to actions that address work in human health. And as an advocacy and education organization, PPAN is exploring policy solutions that can promote sustainable land management practices, safeguard public health, and preserve biodiversity. And so we like to think about policy solutions that could happen at the local, state, and federal levels that can be a path to protecting children, which are a vulnerable population. I'd like to welcome Louise, Routt, and Kyra. We're so excited to have all of you today. Thank you for being here. And our moderator, Louise Chawla, will take it from here. Thanks, Louise.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Joyce. And yes, very much my privilege to be here with two national leaders in the effort to understand the impacts of pesticides on children and how to protect them from harm. I'm here today because I'm a professor emerita in the program in environmental design at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And a large part of my work involves encouraging people to connect children with nature and to play outdoors and healthy green spaces. And I've learned over the years that we have to add, in any effort to do that, we have to add that we are not talking about encouraging children to play outdoors and connect with nature in spaces that have been sprayed with toxic pesticides. And all too often, that is what happens in around schools and in public spaces and parks in cities and towns and agricultural areas also. All of you will get a follow-up list of resources for how to dive into this subject further with information and action. And so that will be coming after. Let me start by introducing our two really prominent speakers. Routt Reigart has worked for 50 years to protect children and adults from the adverse effects of pesticides. He was medical consultant to the National Pesticide Telecommunications Network, a poison control center for pesticide poisoning. He was chair of the American Academy of Pediatrics Committee on Environmental Health and first chair of the board of the Children's Environmental Health Network. He is presently president of the board of Beyond Pesticides. He has worked extensively with the United States Environmental Protection Agency, serving as first chair of their Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee and as a member of the Tolerance Reassessment Advisory Committee. He served on multiple science advisory committees and is a member of their Science Advisory Board. He is the author and editor of many publications, including editor and co-editor of the 5th and 6th, these are the most recent editions, of the EPA's documents on the recognition and management of pesticide poisonings. Kyra Naumoff Shields, Dr. Shields is the Bright Cities, the Healthy Babies, Bright Futures, Bright Cities Program Director. A nationally focused nonprofit working to reduce the largest sources of babies' exposures to toxic chemicals that harm their brain development. She is an environmental health scientist and a mother with over a decade of experience in community engagement and exposure assessment. In addition to her work to reduce toxic pesticide exposure, She has led monitoring and intervention projects in communities suffering from chronic air pollution, both nationally and internationally. She also advised small businesses on strategies to reduce their carbon footprint. Kyra holds a PhD in environmental health sciences, University of California, Berkeley. And I just want to add, Routt is a pediatrician, and just before we came on, he was explaining he still meets with families and their children. So really a privilege to have you here together. I want to start out by Routt. I know you've been doing 50 years of research on children's environmental health. So we're asking you to begin by sharing what research tells us about children's special vulnerabilities to pesticides and the impacts of pesticides on their health and development.
Yes, hello, everybody. I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak to you. Obviously, I can't share 50 years in 20 minutes, but I'm going to try and hit one or two high points. And maybe if we could just have the first slide from this slide is sort of partially to talk about what happens with, quotes, normal use of pesticides, but also a little bit for its shock value. The child on the right is one of the children that suffered from his mother, actually it looks like her mother, being exposed to the drug thalidomide during pregnancy. And during the 1950s, there were thousands of children who were born with limb deformities, as you see in this child, ultimately leading to removal of thalidomide from the market almost totally. It still has a few indications, but it was used for nausea in mothers. The child on the left is a child that I met when he was about 4 years old, whose mother was a field worker in vegetable fields in Immokalee, Florida. While she was pregnant, she was exposed to the pesticides that our farm workers, field workers are exposed to. And he was born, as you can see, with no limbs, but as it turns out, a perfectly normally functioning brain. But his physical deformities led to him being very short-lived. The point, whoops, don't change the slide yet. The important thing, though, is that this is something that occurs when occasionally when mothers are exposed to pesticides while working in the field. As somewhat of an aside, there was another mother who had a pregnant on the same work group or work team who had a pregnancy that by ultrasound, the child was exactly like this. So working in the same field, the same levels of exposure, there were two children with this deformity. She actually terminated her pregnancy. So this is one of the extreme examples, but this is a case where their pesticides were being supposedly used under the proper regulations and precautions. In fact, it wasn't. There was some bad things done by the operators, but in fact, this child was severely affected. But most of the time, what we see with children are much less extreme effects of pesticides. So now we can go to the next slide. Okay, this, I couldn't begin to touch on all we know about pesticides in children, but this was a paper that Dr. Roberts and I published in 2019. So it's about 2 years old, looking at two of the most common neurologic diseases in children today, which are autism spectrum disorder and tension deficit hyperactivity disorder. And we reviewed what is presently known about them, and we looked at what's going on in the lab, what was going on with experimental animals, and what was seen in humans. So we looked at it at all levels of investigation. And if we go to the next slide, these are problems of increasing prevalence. ADHD occurs in about 10 to 15% of children, boys more than girls. Is this, whoops, can go back. Is associated with poverty in certain ethnicities. Autism spectrum disorder, which used to be considered rare, is very common now. As you can see, 1 to 3% of children develop autism spectrum disorder. And if you think about it, that's 3 in 100 children, which is an astounding frequency of something that we once thought was rare. We have been aware for a long time that both of these disorders have a genetic component, but whatever part of it that is not genetics, by definition, is the environment. Because these problems are recognized very early in life, whatever happened to cause them, both genetically and environmentally, had to have happened very early in life. And so the question we were asking in looking at this is this early life environment, to what extent pesticides were a part of it. Now we can go to the next slide. We found 249 papers that looked at this. 115 were human studies, and the rest were either in the laboratory or experimental animals. And there were 15 review articles. Of these papers, 95 of them reported association with pesticides and AD and or autism spectrum disorder. In other words, sometimes they showed both, but only 5 reported no association. So the bottom line, without going into the details of how the associations were shown and what mechanisms were demonstrated, is that there is a very strong association between these rapidly increasing diseases and very early exposure to pesticides by children and the fetus. So the next slide. So what's going on here? Well, this is a schematic of some of the critical stages in development of the brain of children. And it's from Dr. Patricia Rodier. What happens first when the brain is starting to develop is a whole bunch of cells get born. That's proliferation. One stage is that these cells, once they've as these cells have become multiple, they then sort of move and form the structures of the brain that we know of and that you see in pictures. After this process of migration, we see these connections between brain cells, which we call synapses. So that the way cells communicate is through these synapses. And then the next thing that happens, and this is, I'll show you in a minute when this happens, is the cells that are less useful in the brain are, I hate to say it this way, but they're actually killed off by the body. The body says, we don't need these brains. So there is programmed cell death. And then the last 2 pieces is there is this strong association with a lot of these diseases with the transmitters between the cells and the receptors. And you all have heard about things like dopamine. And then finally, even after the cell death, there's a trimming of connections. So if we go to the next slide, it's one of my favorite, no, it's not the next one, it's the one after that. This tells you when it's happening. As you can see at the bottom, it goes through the 9 months of prenatal, and I have a pointer, but you can see the 9 months of the prenatal period, and then the postnatal period up to age 10. And as you can see across the top, proliferation, migration, synapse formation, and then maturation, which occurs in stages. And each of these stages is very susceptible to injury by chemicals and other insults. So the next slide actually is my favorite. So this is, we talked about the process of cells connecting. This is the process of connection between cells. And as you can see, at birth, there are very few connections. By 6 months, there's a few more. And by 2 years, there's this horrible web. And I say horrible intentionally of connections. And what it is, all of you that have children or no children, the reason we have the terrible twos is these over connections in the brain. The brain of the 2-year-old just doesn't know how to control itself because there are so many connections. And then the later processes of cell death and pruning of the connections leads to a mature functioning brain. So let's just go ahead one more step. And I've used about 12 minutes, so we're well on schedule. Can we go to the next slide? So just to look at 2 of the classes of pesticides we're very familiar with. One is the so-called organophosphates, and most of you are familiar with malathion, chlorpyrifos, and some other organophosphates. It's been clearly shown in many publications, which I didn't list on this slide, but we're glad to share at any time. In the neonatal period, children that are exposed in utero to even low levels of organophosphates score lower than unexposed children on the Brazelton neonatal behavior scale. And then as they get a little older, these children exposed in utero and very early don't do well on the Bailey scales of infant development and the so-called mental development index, or MDI. So these are sort of equivalent of an IQ for a young child. And then getting on to your autism spectrum disorder, there are increased rates of so-called pervasive developmental disorder. These are just badly damaged children. So all of these are strong associations with very early and in utero exposure to organophosphate pesticides, even at very low levels. And I don't have time to go into the studies, but many of these have been done with families of farm workers. They've been done in New York City, where housing units were treated with, for instance, chlorpyrifos to kill roaches, and the outcomes are poor in both those settings. Farm workers and city livers, people living in cities, I guess is a way to put it, who are exposed to pesticides, organophosphate pesticides to control pests in their home. Okay, next slide. Another big group of chemicals are the so-called organochlorines. The one that most of you are going to be familiar with is DDT and its metabolite DDE, which was the primary subject of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And again, there are children that are exposed in utero and early in life have poor scores on the Braston assessment scale, don't get ready to be in school. Their preschool confidence is low. Again, the PDI or psychomotor development index is lower. And for children exposed to the organochlorines, there are increased rates of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder when they reach school age, and also increased rates of autism spectrum disorder. I think that's the last slide, but go ahead anyway. Yes. So I was supposed to talk for 20 minutes. I've talked for 16. So we have a few extra minutes later for questions, perhaps.
Routt, we'll be back to you with questions and with some more questions in just a little bit. So, and thank you for, for covering with some broad strokes this very large area of research. Kyra, tell us what motivated you to take up the issue of pesticides in your work with Healthy Babies, Bright Futures.
Kyra, you're muted.
Thank you. Thanks for your help, Joyce. I had a little bit of an issue over here, but thank you all so much for inviting me to be here. I feel very grateful to be in conversation with Routt, with Louise, with Joyce, with Rella from the city of Berkeley. And thanks to you all for taking the time to join the conversation. I love those brain development slides, Routt, and I didn't know I would walk away with the ability to explain my 2-year-old's temper tantrum. So I appreciate that. And before I launch into, why Healthy Babies, Bright Futures is active in the pesticide arena, I just wanted to explain a little bit about our organization. We were formed in 2016, really in response to some of the work that Routt shared. In 2016, a group of academic and medical experts, as well as children's health advocates and practitioners, published a consensus statement in Environmental Health Perspectives, lifting up the burden of neurotoxic exposures, including pesticides, to neurodevelopmental delays like ADHD and autism. And so we're kind of the pragmatic response to that paper and trying to do something about the issue. And at Healthy Babies, Bright Futures, we do that in 3 ways. We have a science research strategic angle where we produce original online action tools and shareable research. And so right now we're really focused on lead in water and researching toxic metals and contaminants in baby foods. We have a communications prong to our strategy where we lift up the work of our organizations as well as partners to try to move the needle on policies and systems that protect babies' brain development. And we have a Bright Cities program. I'm the director of that program, and we provide flexible funding and technical support to cities to support initiatives that reduce neurotoxic exposures, including pesticides. And I do want to point out that it is really fun and a great privilege to work with like over 28 cities on these initiatives. And so pretty much all of the pictures in my presentation are from partners in these cities. And if you have a question about them or want to talk more, feel free to bring it up in the Q&A. Or I'd be happy to talk after this presentation. And so, Routt did a wonderful job saying why this is important, but just bringing that research together, not only with the pesticide exposure, but based on other neurotoxic exposures. 1 in 6 kids today in America have a neurological disability like ADHD, something autism spectrum disorder, or more subtle learning and sensory deficits. This includes my 13-year-old son, Cohen, and so it's a personal issue for me as well. So we have a lot of kids that are impacted So you might say, well, where are they impacted? So this pie chart here, which I invite you to peruse, at the top we see exposure sources to different neurotoxicants. So these are the 8 of the 9 neurotoxins HBBF, Healthy Babies, Bright Futures, seeks to try to reduce, the 9th being phthalates. And on the bottom line there, you'll see the exposure sources for pregnant people. So the green represents food, the autumny golden brown represents dust, the light blue is air, and the darker blue is water. So these are where our kids and everybody's being exposed to neurotoxic exposures. And you can see OP pesticides, OP stands for organophosphate. Our main sources is food. So we have a lot of kids being impacted. We have ubiquitous exposures to neurotoxins. And I also just want to remind you, those slides that Routt showed about the neurodevelopment, during these first few years of life, a child is developing these neural connections at the honestly incredible rate of 1 million per second. And whether or not these connections weaken or thrive influences the formation of the child's brain, which clearly has lasting impacts on their future. So upsetting the development of the architecture of the brain has clearly serious lifelong implications. But just to give you a sense of what that might be in a monetary sense, special education for the estimated 20 million children struggling with a developmental brain disorder are estimated to be 130 billion annually. So it's a big burden that we're all seeking to address. So this just zooms in a bit closer on the organophosphate pesticides. We've further broken it down into age brackets, and you can still see that clearly food is the largest source, although there'll be other sources with kids playing on fields, and playing fields that are treated with pesticides. And then of course, farm worker exposures and other occupational exposures. You might be thinking to yourself, we've heard about pesticides for a long time. Isn't this an old problem? Yes, but it's also today's problem. And this was very clear to me because it happened that yesterday I was in Denver at the American Association of Public Health meeting, and I listened to this very presentation by Dr. Alicia Salvatore. And she's a researcher from Oklahoma. And so they surveyed all the childcare providers in the state to ask about triggers for asthma, actually. And so one of those was pesticides. So in the state of Oklahoma, they looked at childcare providers that both are a childcare center as well as a family childcare home, indicated in this table as an FCCH. And of those over 3,000 providers, 476 responded to the questionnaire. So out of the almost 500 childcare providers, we see that nearly half say they have a pest problem. And of those that have a pest problem, almost 3/4 are using pesticides. And so there's the citation for her paper if you'd like to go and read some more, but it was just very, very surprising to me, this data in terms of how much pesticides are still being used in our childcare centers. And on some data that's not shown here is that very few of the parents knew when the pesticides were actually being applied at the childcare centers. So that's why we got involved, Louise. And I didn't know if you had some follow-up questions or if you'd like me to go through my whole deck.
Well, what I wanted to move on to is, really sobering information. I have to say, I'm actually shocked at the prevalence of how widely these are being applied in childcare centers. And let's move on to what can we do about it. So if you want to start with that, and then Routt will come back to you with that question.
Great, and I love that question because there is a lot that we can do, and there's a ton of resources out there to help all of us. I'm sure Routt can add to this list, but I wanted to, say for all of us at home, because we've seen that food is one of our largest sources of exposures. When we can, good to choose organic produce. Sometimes that's cost prohibitive. And to make those decisions, we recommend using the Environmental Working Group or EWG's annual Dirty Dozen list, which tells you the top 12 types of produce where it is most useful to splurge a little or to buy organic, and the clean 15 list, 15 types of produce that it really doesn't have that big of an impact if you buy organic or conventional. Don't use pesticides at home. There's a lot of resources. One is showcased here. The City of Boulder's that organic lawn care guide. We can all have beautiful turf and beautiful lawns without chemicals. And we can encourage our cities to do the same. Of course, practicing integrated pest management and approaching your leaders about pesticide use reduction strategies. And if we have time, we can talk more about that, but I'm guessing many of you are familiar. So I also wanted to lift up the work at the Children's Environmental Health Network. They have wonderful fact sheets on different types of toxics reduction, including pesticides. Beyond Pesticides has a repository of information about healthy schools and other areas. One of our Bright Cities partners in Anchorage, Alaska, the Alaska Community for Action on Toxics put together this healthy childcare and toxic-free, healthy children, and toxic-free childcare presentation for childcare providers. And it was kind of cool because they did that training, and then the healthcare or the childcare providers could bring in nap mats, like the little blankets or cots that the children sleep on. The older ones typically had flame retardants and phthalates in them, which are neurotoxins, and they switched them out free of charge for the healthiest nap mat on the market. But then this training was integrated into the state of Alaska's continuing education curriculum for childcare providers, therefore providing a sustained exposure reduction. So I've actually passed this training on to the colleague in Oklahoma, hoping that the training can continue. And then, do you want me to stop there, Louise, and then go on to cities after maybe Routt can share resources?
I think go ahead, Kyra, and then we'll give Routt time to jump in and add to this.
Okay. Great. Well, so those were just some, quick actions that an individual can take. And then I was going to share some case studies from the work with cities that we do through the Bright Cities program. So again, this was formed in 2016. It has a reach of over 5,000 kids, 28 Bright Cities. We have 19 states represented. Over half of our projects have completed. We have 10 still underway, and we're also recruiting new cities for next year. So if your city's interested in doing pesticide reduction, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And we often work in partnership with Beyond Pesticides, an organization that Routt is also affiliated with, and PPAN as well. So when you look at our total Bright Cities grant distribution, that blue area that says public housing, so that refers to affordable housing in public spaces, over a third of our budget goes to supporting pesticide use reduction. So I just wanted to give you the flavor of what we do. Our first city that we worked in was Salt Lake City, Utah, and they launched two things. One was a public education campaign called Pesticide Free SLC. Their website's still up. You can see those boxes on your screen. So they have, tips that anybody here can use. But also this is a portable model, and you'll see that the next city borrowed their campaign directly in order to launch pesticide-free PVD, which is Providence, Rhode Island. So they had signs for your yard, and I think they had over 300 pledges that you could indicate you weren't using pesticides. We've made a case study so we can share that with other cities. You could share that with your city leaders. And it really found that, though Healthy Babies Bright Cities is a small organization, that national recognition meant something, and it allowed the city to leverage that recognition for more local funding to continue to support the work. So Salt Lake City did the education and outreach, and then they also did a pilot project to manage turf side by side conventionally and without the use of pesticides. Which, looking back, the sustainability officer said we didn't really need to do it because we have plenty of examples where the turf is very lush without, doing the side-by-side comparison, but this happened to be an appropriate strategy for Salt Lake City. So then this is Providence, Rhode Island. You see those boxes right there front and center. So again, they borrowed right from Salt Lake City's campaign. They launched this campaign on Earth Day this year, collected a lot of testimonials from various sectors in the city about why this was important. And you've seen some of those scattered throughout the presentation. The mayor took the pledge. And I thought one thing that was very unique about their campaign is when they asked their residents to sign up, they wanted homeowners or renters to estimate the square foot associated in their lot with chemical-free turf maintenance. So they actually linked their online survey tool with like zoning data or land use data, I'm not exactly sure, but allowed you to access the square footage of your plot where your house was. So then they could estimate that nearly 500,000 square feet of yard was pledged to go pesticide free. And that's something that I think all of us is a challenge, is to do these metrics to understand the impact of our actions. And so I think this is a great example. They have tied their pesticide free campaign into other integrated sustainability campaigns in the city, relating it to climate justice and environmentally preferable purchasing, and then these goats. So the goats are another way of integrated pest management, and I think primarily eat the poison ivy in their really beautiful Roger Williams Botanical Garden Park. And of course, I would be remiss without mentioning our city here of Boulder that has long time been a leader in chemical-free turf maintenance on city land. And through the Bright Cities Project, are working to transition affordable housing properties here in the city of Boulder to chemical-free turf maintenance as well. So we did a project with Beyond Pesticides. There's Chip Osborne there to begin the transition process in 3 pilot neighborhoods with the highest proportion of kids in those neighborhoods. And you can see there's a variety of turf, right? Some is heavily used where you see the bare dirt in the bottom, and others has a pretty good coverage to start with. So that project is underway. And as I showed earlier, there's a wonderful guide to organic land care. That was, again, a partnership with Boulder Housing Partners in the city and Healthy Babies, Bright Futures. And then I'm just showcasing my own little yard sign to show that we're not using pesticides and kind of spreading the word with neighbors. And the last thing I'll mention is that we also support food equity projects, and though it's a small proportion of our budget, we've had a lot of success with these small grants in terms of increasing the access to mostly organic food. And of all these wonderful projects, the one that I kind of want to lift up is from Salem, Massachusetts, where the mayor, Kim Driscoll, was a real leader, and I helped identify and approve the use of an underutilized, I believe it was a baseball field. And so they turned that into a community garden, and then were able to plant trees around this garden as a community food forest, and envision people just walking by and picking apples. It's all organic. And here she says 7,000 pounds, but I think the latest tally at the end of the summer was they were able to distribute 12,000 pounds of local organic produce to low food access families. And so that was wonderful. So bottom line is there's a lot we can do. This is a start and a small portion of all the partners that are working. And here are some resources on our website. Here's my contact information. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Kyra. And the links to Healthy Babies, Bright Cities, it's also in the resource list that everybody who signed up today will be getting. So Routt, I know that both the Children's Environmental Health Network that you helped create, and also Beyond Pesticides, where you chair the board now, I know that they also offer resources for families and also for civic leaders who want to make changes like this. Could you tell us a bit about that? And then we'll open it up to questions and answers from people here. Routt?
Kyra, that was beautiful.
It was inspiring. It
I
was inspiring.
I can't begin to do that, but yes, let me say the first thing that we really haven't yet talked about is the Academy of Pediatrics several years ago published both a technical document and a policy statement on organic foods, and concluded then, and it's been further supported, that organic foods are better for children than pesticide, chemically grown foods. And one of the things that with Beyond Pesticides, I have been very adamant about is getting rid of a term that you hear a lot called conventional agriculture. Because in fact, the chemical methods used in agriculture now have only been around since the 1940s, 1950s. And conventional agriculture was always chemical free, and it's still chemical free. And so the terms that we really need to use are organic or chemical free agriculture and chemical agriculture. And the health benefits are undeniable with regard to organic foods for children and others. And a great deal of the work we've done with Beyond Pesticides and promoting organic methods of agriculture have focused on the fact that they improve the whole ecosystem. And so we spent a lot of time worrying about pollinators, worrying about the other bad things that happen and related to chemical agriculture. So first, I think it is important to stress that we should be eating organic foods, that we need to promote it, organic agriculture. I think a lot of people don't realize that chemical agriculture is heavily subsidized by our federal government, and organic agriculture is penalized by government policies, because in order for someone to grow food organically, they have to spend a lot of money getting certified. If we put as much money into organic agriculture as we do into growing chemically corn and soybeans, organic food would be much less expensive. And yes, I support Kyra's comment about the work of EWG, Environmental Working Group. Their list is important. Well, but in addition to, I can talk forever about promoting organic, which is really important. And by the way, the cost differential that people always worry about is rapidly vanishing for a lot of reasons that we don't have time to go into, but people can afford to feed their children organic foods. But beyond that, I think it's very important that we stop filling our houses with pesticides. And actually it is true, and I didn't put up a slide about Dr. Roberts, that I work with a lot, actually looked at what happened with regard to pesticide burdens in homes. And they're significant. A lot of this is from the so-called NHANES data, but surprisingly and perhaps happily, commercial applicators did better than homeowners with regard to indoor exposure. I think probably because commercial applicators don't want to use any more than they have to, whereas many homeowners spray far more than they need. But the basic message is we shouldn't be using pesticides in our homes. And then with regard to lawn and garden, I think probably many of you are aware that there are a lot of the projects like Kyra is talking about around the country. Beyond Pesticides has something called the SWAT program. And we have put quite a lot of money into converting places around the country to organic turf management, including Portland, Maine, Montgomery County, Maryland, Irvine, California, my town, Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. And as Kyra pointed out, we've been active in Boulder. So we're well equipped to support everywhere in the country anyone that wants to convert their management, particularly of playing fields. To me, it's horrendous that we allow our children to roll in pesticides when they're playing soccer or whatever the sport is, and it's not necessary. So no pesticides in the home. And we by the way, Kyra, have a really nice placard that you can get from Beyond Pesticides. It says pesticide free zone. And I wish I'd put it up. I have a photograph of the Woodland Park Zoo in Seattle. It has a pesticide free zone sign right out in front. But the point is, we don't need pesticides in our lawn and gardens. We don't need to use them in our homes. And Beyond Pesticides is more than happy to help you with that. And we really should be feeding our children pesticide-free foods, organic foods. I've probably talked enough for right now.
Well, you have so much experience and to share, Routt, and you have every minute is valuable, and the same with you, Kyra. I see a question here about, can you speak to public school systems? Either one of you who wants to take that question first. What can be done to change systems at a large scale, including whole public school systems, both on the grounds and in the schools and in their school lunch programs? One of you want to go for that question?
You want to start, Kyra, or you want me to?
Well, I'll start, Routt, but then I'll leave it to you. And it's an interesting question, Kelly, because I started thinking about the same thing. I'm in Boulder, and my kids are in the Boulder Valley School District lunch program. And so their lunch program is pretty well known in terms of serving very healthy food. So I went on their website yesterday or the other day to look to see what percentage was organic. And that statistic wasn't listed. So I reached out to the grants manager, who emailed me back saying, you know, they do get all their organic apples and things like that, but then their distribution changes and they switch to citrus and they don't know. So I don't know, to be honest, and maybe Routt has more to say. I just feel like the childcare centers are smaller and maybe not governed by all of the regulations that our public school system has to navigate. And so I feel like in my capacity, I could support you more in that way in terms of pointing to resources and helping you work through that. So anyways, I'll turn it over to you, Routt.
Well, I really need to say that it's not experts that drive this process, it's the community. And in every place that we have been successful, including with Beyond Pesticides, because there are people in the community who feel it's important and get together. And even in my, it's called the town of Mount Pleasant, but we're now the third largest city in South Carolina. A member of the public became concerned about the town using pesticides and approached me, but also approached the city, the town, and said, why can't we do this? We enlisted a couple of the town council members, and it quickly builds because people don't want their children exposed to pesticides and want their children fed healthy. So my best advice is for not have the experts try to beat on the governmental agencies, but enlist the public. The same thing has occurred in many places, again, including where I live. resistance to spraying for nuisance mosquitoes is a horrendous thing to do. And once people become concerned for whatever reason about it, they don't want their children sprayed, they don't want their pollinators to die, you can quickly build a groundswell of support, but it's got to come from the public. You know, I can't convince anybody without public support, and I'm sure Kyra would say the same thing. That when you want something to change, you get everybody to push.
Do you want to add to that, Kyra? Yeah, certainly a critical point that Routt made there. And then last few minutes, I know Joyce will take it over for closing, but Joyce has worked on these issues of trying to make change in the school policies in Connecticut and is aware of state initiatives to do that. So maybe Joyce, when you take it over at the end, you could say a little bit about how change was made in Connecticut. But first, Kyra, do you want to add some closing words related to this?
I just thank everybody for their time and challenge all of us to, decide what we can take away from this webinar and make one action, whether it be, at our home, talking to a friend or neighbor, connecting city staff that you might know with me at Healthy Babies Bright Futures or Routt to work through the Children's Environmental Health Network or Beyond Pesticide. But it really, I don't want to burden us with more work to do, but like we all want to do this for our kids. And so I want to take away Routt's developmental brain slides and share those more because that story is meaningful to me. And I think just that knowledge helps people take action. But I just challenge you to take one thing away that you're going to do, however small it is, that's a step. So thank you.
I've just got to say one more thing because I see questions. USDA, remember that we have a national organic program that's administered by USDA, and there have been a lot of pressure to water down the organic standard, and we being Beyond Pesticides on our daily blog often ask people to chime in on protecting organic from people that want to change the standard in a way that makes it more lenient. So I would encourage everybody to go to Beyond Pesticides. It's beyondpesticides.org. Sign up for our daily blog. Sign up for our weekly actions. Every week we give you an action to take to protect organic. And do these things, because that's where the public support builds, and the more people that respond to our pleas to take actions to protect the organic standard and to do our weekly actions, the more effective we'll be.
Great, thank you. That's a good, very practical, actionable item, Routt. Joyce, do you want to pick it up in the closing? Just tell us a little bit about what happened in Connecticut, and then you'll round this off.
Thanks again, Kyra, Routt, and Louise. This has been extremely informative, and we appreciate your time very much. I can just touch briefly. I raised my 3 children in Connecticut. I was concerned about pesticide use on school grounds. I started asking questions locally in the school system, town hall. I asked for notifications when the fields were going to be sprayed. I wouldn't allow my children to play soccer when the fields were sprayed for several days or until it rained, but that didn't seem like a long-term solution. So I got involved with a group of people and that advocated for a state law. And it took several years, but over that period of time, we gathered a very diverse group of folks from medical doctors. Connecticut's on the coast, so there were some fishermen involved, parents, just a very diverse group that worked together to bring that to the state legislature and get that policy changed. And so there now is a law through middle school that disallows pesticide use on school grounds. Unfortunately, didn't make it through high school. So just to touch on that, that is, as Routt mentions, having kind of a ground up sort of swell of interest and attention on the issue can be very important. And just to bring us home, because we're coming up on the hour, I put registration for the Pollinator Summit in the chat box. We would love to have some of you attend next week. There's going to be some things I think that would be of great interest to you. We will have some state lawmakers at the summit to talk about things that we can be doing to support pollinator health. And of course, when we talk about pollinator health, that relates to human health. And that's why we were the people and pollinators. So I always like to bring that to everyone's attention. And we also have 4 different communities that will be speaking in the afternoon about ways that they are actually acting to make changes in their communities to support pollinator health. So I think that will be of great interest, as well as some wonderful sessions on bee atlases and bee monitoring, people from other states that have done a great job on some of those community participation projects. So Louise, thank you. Kyra, thank you. Routt, thank you. This has been a great session. We will be posting this to YouTube in case you would like to see it again or share with others. And we hope to see you again at another webinar soon.
Yes, and Joyce, I just want to say, yes, and we'll also be sending out the resource list for more information and action. And we've been talking about children's immediate health right now, but what you're talking about there with the Pollinator Summit is a legacy of a biodiverse world, is something we also all want to pass on to our children. And that's what it will be about.